The title of this lecture is The Rise of Rome, circa 750 BC to 44 BC. Early Roman history is a strange combination of both fact and fiction. So what do we know about the actual origins and beginnings of the city of Rome? By around 750 BC, three groups were living on the 7 hills that make up the city of Rome. These three groups were the Romans or Latins, the Greeks, and the Etruscans. It appears that probably the first settlers to the 7 hills of Rome were the Etruscans, probably arriving on these 7 hills as early as 1200 BC. The Greek colonists settled in Rome around 750 BC in an attempt to escape the Greek Dark Age, which was one of the items that we discussed briefly in our discussion of Chapter 3. The Romans or Latins also lived on the 7 hills of Rome. These three groups, the Romans, the Greeks, and the Etruscans, shared the 7 hills of Rome, lived together, borrowed culture, shared ideas with each other. The Romans or Latins were simple small farmers who lived under the domination of Etruscan kings. The Romans, in fact, were not the leaders of Rome in the beginning of Roman history. The Etruscans were, in fact, the kings of Rome. The Greeks had a profound impact on what we think of as Roman culture. In fact, many historians refer to Roman culture as Greco-Roman or classical culture because, as one Roman historian and poet wrote, captive Greece took captive her conqueror. It was Greece that had the most profound impact culturally on the development of Roman civilization. Somewhere around 509 BC, the situation changed. And what exactly occurred in 509 BC has been lost to us and more or less has become the stuff of legend. The Romans accused the Etruscans of stealing their women and raping their women. More than likely what happened is that the Romans just grew tired of Etruscan domination and decided to take control over Rome themselves and staged a civil war in 509 BC which drove out the Etruscans and gave control over Rome to the Romans. This is the actual founding of Rome, but according to the Romans, there were a couple of different ways that their city began. What I've just shared with you is what we know as fact. Now, what the Romans tell us about how their city began is actually contradictory. They had 2 different versions of the origins of Rome. One comes to us from an epic poem called the Aeneid, written by an important writer of the 1st century BC, a poet named Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid. In this epic poem, Aeneas is a survivor from the Trojan War between the Trojans and the Greeks. This, of course, makes reference to the Greek poet Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And basically what Virgil tells us is that after the Greeks and Trojans ended their war called the Trojan War, one particular Trojan prince set sail away from Troy and landed in Italy and found a city, and this city came to be known as Rome. A second and more widely accepted foundation myth for the Roman people was the story of Romulus and Remus, who, according to this myth, were twin boys that were abandoned by their father into the Tiber River, the most important river in Italy and for the survival of Rome. And these 2 boys were found, raised, and suckled by a she-wolf. And as these 2 boys grew into adulthood, they were noticed by another farmer and shepherd who thought it was a little strange for 2 boys to be living with a wolf, so he took them in, and these 2 boys, Romulus and Remus, twin brothers, made opposing settlements on Rome's hills. And as the story goes, Remus made fun of or ridiculed his brother's wall and gardens and work and jumped over the wall, and Romulus killed his brother in an act of rage, and Romulus is for whom the city of Rome is named. The Romans actually did not attempt to write their first history of their civilization until 1,000 years after their city had already been founded. The subject of the founding of Rome is the focus of Livy's multi-volume history of Rome entitled From the Founding of the City, or in Latin, Ab Urbe Condita. This series of books gives us great information about how the city of Rome developed, flourished, and its governmental systems. Let's turn our attention now to the Roman Republic, which is dated 509 BC to 31 BC. In 509 BC, the Latin or Roman small number of farmers who lived under the domination of the Etruscans overthrew the last Etruscan king, a man named Tarquin the Proud. This began Roman rule of Rome. So how did the Romans go from ruling Rome to a vast empire that stretched around the Mediterranean? Well, between 509 and 31 BC, here's what happens. The Romans start in their own neck of the woods. They wanted control of northern and central Italy, which they did through diplomacy. They actually worked with other Latin peoples. Latin is a term for the ethnicity of the people that lived in Italy. The Romans used diplomacy and met with these various Latin groups and asked them if they would be willing to join up with the Romans in a military alliance for their own good, for the good of all of these Latins. The Latins in northern and central Italy agreed to do so. The Romans then used their newly acquired allies to defeat Latins in southern Italy called the Samnites, who refused diplomatic attempts by the Romans to bring the Samnites into the fold of Rome. The Samnites were defeated by the so-called Latin League. This was the Romans plus all of their allies in northern and central Italy. After the Samnite Wars ended, the Romans turned on their allies in the Latin League and forced those areas to join up with Rome. So, from the Latin League as well as the Samnite Wars, the Romans found themselves in control of Italy by 304 BC. They then turned their attention to land surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea was conquered by the Romans by 133 BC. This was done by winning the so-called Punic Wars against Carthage. Today, if you were to look on a map of northern Africa, you would not see Carthage. That city-state no longer exists. What's in its place today is the modern-day city Tunis in Tunisia. The Carthaginians were the major economic rival and competitor to the Romans in the Mediterranean Sea. The Romans accused the Carthaginians of all sorts of horrible things like cannibalism and human sacrifice, particularly of children, in order to unite the Roman people against this enemy of Carthage. What it really boils down to is none of these issues of cannibalism or human sacrifice. I mean, there's scant evidence, really no evidence that either of those things happened in Carthage, but the Romans used it as a propaganda tool to unite the Roman people against a common enemy. What the Romans wanted was economic control of the Mediterranean, and the city-state of Carthage stood in Rome's way. Carthage was a major commercial competitor at the time. So in a series of wars known as the Punic Wars, Rome defeated Carthage. The First Punic War was actually fought just off the coast of Italy on a tiny little island called Sicily. Sicily was eyed, or I guess another way to put it was that the Carthaginians and the Italians both had their eye on conquering this island of Sicily. Both wanted it, and the Romans could not stand the thought of Carthage being so very close to the tip of Italy. So the First Punic War was fought between Carthage and Rome for control of Sicily. Rome won, and Sicily became the first Roman province. The Second Punic War was fought over Spain. Spain was used by the Carthaginians for valuable copper mines that were found there, as well as for soldiers in their army. In the Second Punic War, the Romans fought to drive out the Carthaginians from Spain. And I'm not trying to complicate this to you, but at the end of the First Punic War, it was evident to both Rome and Carthage that they were both interested in Spain. So it had been decided at the end of the First Punic War that the northern part of Spain would go to Rome, the southern part to Carthage. This was never going to work, sharing Spain, because both of these, Rome and Carthage, were interested in being completely and totally in control of Spain. So during the Second Punic War, the famous Carthaginian commander Hannibal chased a Roman general by the name of Fabian all the way back to the gates of Rome itself. At one point, Hannibal used elephants to cross the Alps into Italy. This, of course, was alarming to the Romans. It was the closest scare they had ever received. So, at this point, the general named Fabian was replaced by a much better Roman commander named Scipio Africanus, who quickly drove out Hannibal by attacking Carthage itself. Hannibal was forced to leave Italy, go back to Carthage, and defend his home city. At the end of the Second Punic War, Carthage was defeated. Spain was acquired by the Romans. The Third Punic War was completely and totally unnecessary. The Third Punic War was just one last attempt by the Romans to show their complete and total control and power over Carthage. In the Third Punic War, Carthage was razed, burned to the ground. Most of its inhabitants were killed. Only a sparse population was left behind. Salt was sown into the soil surrounding Carthage so that the people would not be able to produce crops. This, of course, ensured that the Carthaginians would be dependent on the Romans. So Carthage became a Roman province called Africa. The Romans, at the end of the Third Punic War, began to refer to the Mediterranean Sea as Mare Nostrum, which is Latin for our sea. By defeating Carthage, which had been Rome's only major challenger in the Mediterranean Sea, the Romans stood supreme in the ancient world. During this period, known as the Roman Republic from 509 BC to 31 BC, Rome is not only expanding into Italy, Sicily, Spain, and northern Africa, they're also building a very important political system called a republic. And this republic had a great impact on the founding fathers of our country. They fell in love with many of the concepts of the Roman Republican system. In the government of the republic, social differences became political divisions. What I mean by that is that a lower class common person called a plebeian was not allowed to participate in any high-ranking position in the Roman Republic. He could only express himself in gatherings called assemblies. The high-ranking, wealthy landowning class of Romans, called the patricians, held the major positions in the Roman Republic. They dominated society and also dominated government in the Republic. Just to give you a little more information here, patricians were a minority in the Roman Republic. They were the landed, wealthy class. The majority of people were the plebeians. These were individuals who held jobs and did all of the work in Rome. They were the soldiers, the artisans, the craftsmen. They were the working class people, and they made up the majority of Roman society. The patricians would not have been able to enjoy their favored status as commanders and generals in Rome's army or as wealthy landowners without the work of the plebeians. What the patricians had was based on the work of the plebeians. The plebeians, of course, did not take kindly to the fact that they were resigned to the lowest level of government, and that being the assemblies. They were only allowed to express their opinions and offer up ideas. Most of the time, their ideas and their suggestions were ignored by the patricians. The patricians liked things just the way they were, or the so-called status quo. They wanted to keep things as they were because they were benefiting from the status quo. Plebeians, of course, desired change. It is important to note that the leaders of the Roman Republic from 509 BC to 31 BC were called consuls. Only in times of an emergency could a consul assume complete dictatorial power over Rome. The Romans absolutely, positively hated the concept of monarchy. This, of course, comes from the influence of the Greeks, but it also has a lot to do with the Etruscans. When the Romans drove out the last Etruscan king, Tarquin the Proud, in 509 BC, they made up their mind at that point they never wanted another monarch or king again. After all, it's kind of hard to get rid of a monarch. You have to have war to drive him out. Whereas if you have something like maybe, popularly elected officials, that's much easier to handle. If you get a leader you don't like, you just don't vote for him the next time. So the Romans provided in their constitution that in times of emergency only, for 6 months at a time, a consul could assume dictatorial power, meaning that he would have complete control over the Roman Republic in case of emergency, like an invasion. As you can imagine, one of these times would have been during Hannibal's invasion of the city of Rome. In normal peacetime, the Roman Republic was run by 2 men who were elected annually, who were rich, powerful patricians who had their own military, who were responsible for raising taxes, proposing laws, protecting Rome and its newly acquired provinces. These 2 men were called consuls. In order to keep each other in check, they had a system of checks and balances called veto. Veto is a simple Latin phrase that means I forbid. If one consul did not like a law that was proposed by the other consul, all he had to say was veto, I forbid, and that was the end of it. These 2 men kept a check and balance on each other's power through the power of veto. The consuls were elected every year by the Roman people. They were usually younger men with new, fresh ideas. From time to time, the 2 consuls had to be out of town, out of Rome, which makes perfect sense. If they're responsible for overseeing Rome's army and its military, they would have to be out of Rome from time to time, gaining more territory for the city of Rome and the Roman Republic. When they were out of town leading military maneuvers someplace else, they were replaced for the duration by 4 men who filled in for the consuls called praetors. Praetors you can think of as like substitute consuls. Just like in high school when your teacher was out and you had a substitute teacher. When the consuls were out of Rome, Rome had substitute consuls called praetors. The consuls, or praetors if the consuls happened to be out of town, were aided and assisted by 300 men called the Senate, or the senators. These 300 men were appointed by the consuls for a life term, so when a senator died, whoever the reigning consul was went through a pool of applicants and decided on the replacement of that senator. The senators held their job for life. There was no such thing as retirement from the Senate. A man was no longer a senator when he died. So the Senate had a tendency, unlike the consuls, to be elderly men who were very wise and had a great deal of experience. The sole purpose of the Senate was to act as advisors to the consuls on issues of taxes and lawmaking. They were only supposed to offer advice. But over time, the Senate grew in power so much so that whenever the Senate offered a law or a suggestion, a smart consul knew that had to become law. So the senators definitely wanted to protect their power and to protect this system known as the Republic. In order to do so, from time to time, the Senate would act as assassins. This was not an official job description. However, the Senate did assassinate individuals in the Roman Republic that they thought were jeopardizing the Roman Republican system. Their most famous victim was Julius Caesar, who they feared aspired to be a dictator for life or a king. But Caesar was not the only victim of the Roman Senate. In the period known as the Late Republic, from 133 to 31 BC, there was a great deal of social strife and extremely ambitious politicians. During the Late Republic, the plebeians got fed up with being resigned to the lowest realm of the Roman Republican government. They desired to have more opportunities in life. They desired to be able to marry into the patrician class. That was forbade by law. They wanted to be able to serve as consuls, generals in the army, but those things were not allowed. Two patrician men by the name of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, or simply the Gracchi brothers, though they were patricians, sympathized with the plebeians. These two brothers recognized that they and all other patricians would not have soldiers to command in the army if it weren't for the plebeians. Their land wouldn't be worked if it wasn't for the plebeians. So the Gracchi brothers, at great harm to themselves, suggested reforms to aid the plebeians. Tiberius, for example, proposed land redistribution. In other words, taking land from the patricians and giving it to veterans and the poor. He was accused by the Senate of wanting to be dictator, and this was largely because what the Senate saw was that Tiberius was a traitor to his own class, and because Tiberius was so incredibly popular with the plebeians who saw him as a champion, as their hero, they surrounded him, mobbed him wherever he went, and the Senate thought this was a grave threat to the Roman Republic. With so much popular support, they feared Tiberius could become dictator, so he was assassinated by the Senate. His brother Gaius proposed and actually achieved for the plebeian class fixed prices on grain and extended citizenship to all members of the Latin League. The Senate agreed to these. They didn't think these ideas were too radical or too dangerous, but just to make sure that Gaius didn't get out of control, he was also murdered by the Senate. The deaths of the Gracchi brothers led to a civil war between patricians and plebeians. The plebeians saw the Gracchi brothers as great champions and heroes to the plebeian cause. They wanted changes in Rome. The patricians wanted to keep things the same. So, following the deaths of the Gracchi brothers, there was a long period of civil war in Roman history. And of course, since this is a period of civil war or emergency, men who were elected as consuls can claim to be dictators. These men included Marius, Sulla, and the First Triumvirate. Marius was an extremely wealthy patrician who used his military to hold the title of consul and dictator from 104 to 86 BC. What happened to a one-year term as a consul? What happened to a 6-month limit for a dictator? Marius died in 86 BC, and his supporters were eventually defeated in war by a man named Sulla, who was also a wealthy patrician with his own army. Sulla, too, used his military to hold the title of consul from 82 to 79 BC. Again, what happens to the one-year term for a consul? Sulla voluntarily abdicated or gave up the consulship in 79 BC. With his abdication, or giving up the title of consul in 79 BC, Rome was plunged into complete chaos for 20 years. In 59 BC, the real successor to Sulla was a three-man alliance called the First Triumvirate, made up of three of Rome's wealthiest, most powerful patricians who each owned his own army. Those men were Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. They formed an alliance in 59 BC called the First Triumvirate to rule Rome. In 59 BC, for all practical purposes, the Roman Republic is coming to an end. These three men, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, put the final nail in the coffin of the Roman Republic. These three men totally ignore the Roman tradition since 509 BC. Three men ruling at once, only supposed to be two, and they're supposed to be popularly elected. These three men assume or take control. The two men who are supposed to rule Rome are supposed to be consuls. We have three men called the triumvirs ruling Rome in 59 BC. In our next lecture, we'll talk in depth about the First Triumvirate and how it quickly becomes a three-way power struggle for sole control of Rome.